Hi, happy Wednesday, everyone. I'm Charlotte, and this is Quarantine Story Time, when we'll be reading aloud from War and Peace by Leah Tolstoy. It's a classic work of literature, now in public domain, and I'm happy to be sharing it with you. It's a case of silver linings and taking a little lemon and making some lemonade, or maybe like a lemon meringue pie, whatever, or lemon cookies, my personal favorite. But yeah, since many people around the world, in the US and outside of the US, are under lockdown or shelter-in-place orders or being requested to stay home, I thought I'd take this time to read a book that many of us have been told that we should have read in our lives, and I haven't, which is shameful to me, as I do love to read and grew up reading many wonderful works of classic literature. So I'm happy to have the time to read this amazingly thick book. It's 4 pounds of book. I've weighed it. So yeah. So if this is your first time, welcome. And we are still in the beginning of the book, but we're close to 2/10 of the way, so almost a fifth of the way into the book. It's broken up into volumes, parts, and sections. So I'm trying to read a couple sections each day. We are still in volume 1, but we are now in part 3, and we'll be reading section 6 and 7 today. And if this is your first time, or perhaps you missed a section, I do have a War and Peace playlist up where I put each live reading into the playlist so you can read back through, or if perhaps you maybe need some ambient background noise, there's always me reading this book. And as a note, I am reading it live for the first time. Like I said, I haven't read this before, so it is a live reading in the sense of I may get some names wrong, I may stumble through some of the wording of Tolstoy, and as we've discovered, I thought that the biggest challenge would be the Russian names, but Tolstoy also has woven plenty of French, whole French sentences, paragraphs into the story, Italian, German. So I'm doing my best with all of that. When there's footnotes available for large chunks of foreign language, I will just jump to the footnotes so that we kind of, or perhaps offer the translation after I stumble through if it seems like it's something really key. But sometimes when there's just like a few little lines of dialogue back and forth in French, I sometimes like to just leave it and read it. One, because I think it's a really good exercise for myself to try working on different foreign language sounds. And 2, for you, because I think it's interesting to remember that we do live in a very diverse world, and it's really beautiful the way we're all different and that we can all kind of have our own background to come from and different sounds that are normal to us. And to that end, everyone would always be speaking the language that you know. And so I think it is a good reminder to us all that we may not always understand everything, but sometimes you just make the best of what you have. So yeah, so those are my little notes. There may be stuff we just don't understand, but we'll not understand it together. Tune in or subscribe or check out the playlist if you missed some, and bear with the fact that it's a live reading and very impromptu. I have a live chat up for the video because it is a live video, which is fun. So feel free to jump in with any fun comments or questions, and if I can answer them in the middle of the story, I will. Sometimes we find the answers as we go along, which is always great as well. And I am sorry also too if the sound quality is a little strange. I am just recording it off a computer, so I've been eyeballing a couple different microphones. So with finances allow, hopefully I'll get a new microphone and can offer you a little bit better sound quality. But I appreciate those of you who are here and here every day, mostly my mom, but moms are the best. Thanks, Mom. And many other friends who pop in and out. So that's really great, and I appreciate the support, and I hope that you find it edifying as well. So without too much further ado, we'll jump back in. Like I said, we're in volume 1, part 3, section 6 and 7, which the previous was in Bald Hills, the home of the Volokhonsky family, and the old prince was entertaining Prince Vasily and his incorrigible son Anatoly, who wanted to set up a marriage between Anatoly and Prince Bolkonsky's daughter, Princess Maria. Princess Maria is nearsighted, sort of a meek, downtrodden, it seems, individual who's kind of much rushed over by other people. In this case, her sort of friend, lady in waiting, this, I think she's a orphaned or a young French lady of hardly any background, who's been raised by the Bolkonskys. In this case, Mademoiselle Bourrienne had a romantic tryst with Anatoly and has declared herself to Princess Maria in love. And so Princess Maria, while she's been dreaming of marriage and moving away from her father and having a life of her own where she could hopefully flourish, has decided not to, and to hopefully support her Mademoiselle Bourrienne in any way she can to be able to marry Prince Anatoly. Which I feel bad for her, but I'm also glad because Anatoly is just a vapid scoundrel, in my opinion. So I'm glad that she's not stuck with that, because he would have been probably having affairs behind her back anyways if they got married, so just circumvent that for her sake. But anyways, so that's what just happened. And so let's just jump back in and see what comes next. For a long time, the Rostovs had no news of Nikolushka. If for some of you may recall, the Count Rostov had his son Nikolai. He was a young soldier who took his orders, and he was in one of the large battles. And last we heard, he had somehow really grievously hurt his arm. For a long time, the Rostovs had no news of Nikolushka. Only in midwinter was the Count handed a letter addressed in what he recognized as his son's handwriting. On receiving the letter, the Count fearfully and hastily, trying not to be noticed, ran on tiptoe to his study, shut himself in, and began to read. Anna Mikhailovna, learning, as she knew everything that went on in the house, of the letter that had come, went into the Count's study with soft steps and found him with the letter in his hands, sobbing and laughing at the same time. Anna Mikhailovna, though her affairs had improved, went on living with the Rostovs. Mon bon ami, Anna Mikhailovna uttered with questioning sadness and a readiness for all sorts of sympathy. The Count sobbed still louder. Nikolushka, a letter, wounded, was ma chérie, wounded, my darling boy, my little Countess, promoted to officer. Thank God, how shall I tell my little Countess? Anna Mikhailovna sat down beside him, took her handkerchief, wiped the tears from his eyes, the letter stained by them, and her own tears, read the letter, reassured the Count, and decided that she would prepare the Countess over dinner, and before tea, and after tea would announce everything with God's help. All through dinner, Anna Mikhailovna talked about rumors of the war, about Nikolushka. She asked twice when the last letter had come from him, though she already knew, and observed that a letter could very easily come that day. Every time these hints made, the Countess began to worry and look anxiously now at the Count, now at Anna Mikhailovna. Anna Mikhailovna quite imperceptibly turned the conversation to insignificant subjects. Natasha, the best endowed of all the family with the ability to detect the nuances of intonations, glances, and facial expressions, had pricked up her ears since the beginning of dinner, and knew that there was something between her father and Anna Mikhailovna, and something concerning her brother, and that Anna Mikhailovna was making preparations. In spite of all her boldness, Natasha knew how sensitive her mother was to everything that had to do with the news of Nikolushka. She did not venture to ask any questions during the dinner, and ate nothing from anxiousness, and fidgeted on her chair, not listening to her governess's reproaches. After dinner, she rushed headlong after Anna Mikhailovna and threw herself on her neck at full speed in the sitting room. Auntie, darling, tell me, what is it? Nothing, my friend. No, my darling, my dear heart, my honey, my peach. I won't let go. I know you know something. Anna Mikhailovna shook her head. Vous êtes un fille mouche, mon enfant, she said. A letter from Nikolenka? Surely, cried Natasha, reading the affirmative answer in Anna Mikhailovna's face. But for God's sake, be more careful. You know what a shock it may give your maman. I will be, but tell me. You won't? Then I'll go and tell her now. Anna Mikhailovna briefly recounted to Natasha the contents of the letter on the condition that she not tell anyone. My noble word of honor, said Natasha, crossing herself. I won't tell anyone, and she immediately ran to Sonia. Nikolenka, wounded, a letter, she said solemnly and joyfully. Nicholas? Sonia merely said, instantly turning pale. Seeing the impression of the news of her brother's wound made on Sonia, Natasha felt for the first time the whole grievous side of this news. She rushed to Sonia, embraced her, and wept. Slightly wounded, but promoted to officer. He's recovered now. He wrote himself, she said through her tears. It's obvious all you women are crybabies, said Petya, pacing the room in big, resolute strides. I'm very glad, really very glad, that my brother has distinguished himself. You're all blubberers. You understand nothing. Natasha smiled through her tears. You haven't read the letter? Asked Sonia. No, I haven't, but she said it's all over and he's already an officer. Thank God, said Sonia, crossing herself. But maybe she deceived you? Let's go to Maman. Petya silently paced the room. If I were in Nikolushka's place, I'd have killed even more of those Frenchmen, he said. They're so disgusting. I'd have cut down so many. There'd be a whole pile, Petya went on. Shut up, Petya. What a fool you are. I'm not a fool. The fools are the ones who cry over trifles, said Petya. Do you remember him? Natasha suddenly asked, after a moment's silence. Sonia smiled. Do I remember Nicholas? No, Sonia. Do you remember him so as to remember everything? Remember really well, said Natasha with an assiduous gesture, evidently wishing to give her words the most serious meaning. I remember Nikolenko, too. I do, she said. But not Boris. I don't remember him at all. What? You don't remember Boris? Sonia asked in surprise. It's not that I don't remember him. I know who he is. I don't remember the way I do Nikolenka. I close my eyes and I remember him, but Boris, I don't. She closed her eyes. No, nothing. Ah, Natasha, Sonia said rapturously and seriously, without looking at her friend, as if she had considered her unworthy of what she intended to say, and as if she was saying it to someone else, and with whom it was impossible to joke. I've fallen in love with your brother once and for all, and whatever happens to him or to me, I will never stop loving him. All my life. Natasha looked at Sonia with astonished, curious eyes and said nothing. She felt that what Sonia had said was true, that there was such love as Sonia was talking about, but Natasha had never experienced anything like that. She believed it could be, but did not understand it. Will you write to him? She asked. Sonia fell to thinking. The question of how to write to Nicholas, and whether she should write to him, was a question that tormented her. Now he was already an officer and a wounded hero. It would be right on her part to remind him of herself and, as it were, of the commitment he had taken upon himself in her regard. I don't know. I think, since he writes, I'll write too, she said, blushing. And you won't be ashamed to write to him? Sonia smiled. No. But I'd be ashamed to write to Boris, so I won't. Ashamed of what? Just so I don't know. Awkward, ashamed. But I know why she'd be ashamed, said Petya, offended by Natasha's first remark, because she was in love with that fat one in the spectacles. So Petya described his namesake, the new Count Bezukhov. Now she's in love with this singer. Petya was referring to Natasha's Italian singing teacher. So she's ashamed. Petya, you're so stupid, said Natasha. No stupider than you, old girl, said the 9-year-old Petya, as if he was an old brigadier. The Countess had been prepared during dinner by Anna Mikhailovna's hints. Going to her room, she sat in an armchair, not taking her eyes from the miniature portrait of her son on a snuff-box, and tears welled up in her eyes. Anna Mikhailovna came to the Countess's room on tiptoe with the letter and paused. Don't come in, she said to the old Count, who was following her. Later, she said, and closed the door behind her. The Count put his ear to the keyhole and began to listen. At first he heard the sounds of indifferent talk, then only the sound of Anna Mikhailovna's voice making a long speech, then a cry, then silence, then both voices again, speaking together with joyful intonations, then footsteps, and then Anna Mikhailovna opened the door to him. Anna Mikhailovna's face bore the proud expression of a surgeon who had completed a difficult amputation and admits to the public so that they can appreciate his art. C'est fait, she said to the Count, pointing with a solemn gesture to the Countess, who was holding the snuff-box with the portrait in one hand and the letter in the other, pressing her lips first to one and then the other. Seeing the Count, she held her arms out to him, embraced his bald head, and again over his bald head looked at the letter and the portrait, and again pushed the bald head slightly away so as to press her lips to them. Vera, Natasha, Sonia, and Petya came into the room, and the reading began. In the letter, Nikolushka gave a brief description of the march, the 2 battles in which he had taken part, and his promotion to officer, and said that he had kissed the hands of Maman and Papa, and asked their blessings, and kissed Vera, Natasha, and Petya. Besides that, he sent his greetings to Monsieur Schelling, Madame Schoss, and the nanny, and besides that, he asked them to kiss his dear Sonia, whom he loved as ever and remembered as ever. Hearing that, Sonia blushed so much that tears came into her eyes, and unable to bear the gazes turned to her, she rushed to the ballroom, made a run, twirled, and her dress ballooning, all flushed and smiling, sat down on the floor. The Countess was crying. "What are you crying for, Maman?" said Vera. "From all that he writes, you should rejoice and not cry." That was perfectly correct, but the Count and the Countess and Natasha, everyone looked at her with reproach. "Who does she take after?" thought the Countess. Nikolushka's letter was read 100 times, and those who were deemed worthy of listening to it had come to the Countess, who never let it out of her hands. Tutors, nannies, Mitenka, some acquaintances came, and the Countess reread the letter each time with new delight, and each time through this letter discovered new virtues in her Nikolushka. How strange, extraordinary, joyful it was that her son, that son who 20 years ago had moved his tidy limbs barely perceptibly inside her, that son over whom she had quarreled with the too indulgent Count, that son who had first learned to say Brash and then Mama, that this son was now there in a foreign land, in foreign surroundings, a manly warrior, alone, with no help or guidance, and doing there some manly business of his own. All the worldwide, age-old experiences showing that children grow up in an imperceptible way from cradle to manhood did not exist for the Countess. Her son's maturing had been at every point an extraordinary for her, as if there had not been millions upon millions of men who had matured in just the same way, as if it was hard to believe 20 years ago that the little being who lived somewhere under her heart would start crying and suck her breast and begin to talk. So now it was hard to believe that this same being could be the strong, brave man, an example to sons and people that he was now, judging by this letter. "What Chatil! How nicely he describes things," she said, reading the descriptive part of the letter. "And what soul! Nothing about himself, nothing. About some Denisov, but he himself is probably braver than all of them. He writes nothing about his sufferings. And what heart! It's so like him. And how he remembered everyone. He didn't forget anybody. I always said when he was only so high, I always said." For more than a week, the whole house prepared, wrote drafts, and rewrote clean copies of letters to Nikolushka, under the Countess's supervision, and the Count's solicitude that necessary things and money be gathered to outfit the newly promoted officer and provide for his needs. Anna Mikhailovna, a practical woman, had been able to arrange patronage for herself and her son in the army, even for purposes of correspondence. She could send her letters to the Grand Duke Konstantin Pavlovich, who commanded the guards. The Rostovs assumed that the letter "Russian Guards Abroad" was a perfectly definite address, and that if the letter reached the Grand Duke, who was in command of the guards, there was no reason to think it would not reach the Pavlogradsky regiment, which should be in the vicinity, and therefore it was decided to send the letters and money through the Grand Duke's couriers to Boris, and Boris would have to deliver them to Nikolushka. There were letters from the old Count, from the Countess, from Petya, from Vera, from Natasha, and from Sonia, and finally 6,000 rubles for outfitting, as well as various things the Count sent to his son. Section 7. On the 12th of November, Kutuzov's active army, camped near Olmutz, was preparing to be reviewed the next day by 2 emperors, Russian and Austrian. The guards, just arrived from Russia, were spending the night some 10 miles from Olmutz, and the next day would come straight to the review, entering the field at Olmutz by 10 o'clock in the morning. Nikolai Rostov received a note from Boris that day informing him that the Izmailovsky regiment was spending the night 10 miles from Olmutz, and that Boris was waiting for him so as to give him a letter and some money. Rostov especially needed the money now, since the troops, having returned from the campaign, were stationed near Olmutz, where well-stocked sutlers and Austrian Jews filled the camp, offering all sorts of temptations. The Pavlogradsky hussars had one feast after another, celebrating the rewards that they had received for the campaign, and made trips to Olmütz to visit the newly arrived Carolina the Hungarian, who had opened a tavern there with female waiters. Rostov had recently celebrated his promotion to cornet, had bought Bedouin, Denisov's horse, and was in debt all around to comrades and sutlers. On receiving Boris's note, Rostov rode to Olmütz with a comrade, had dinner there, drank a bottle of wine, and rode on alone to the guards' camp to look for his childhood friend. Rostov had not yet had time to outfit himself. He was in a much-worn junker's jacket with a soldier's cross, the same sort of riding breeches with a shabby leather seat, and an officer's saber with a sword knot. He was riding a Don horse that he had bought from a Cossack while on campaign. His crumpled hussar's cap was dashingly pushed back and cocked. Riding up to the camp of the Izmailovsky regiment, he was thinking how he would impress Boris and all his comrades in the guards by his look of a battle-seasoned hussar. The guards had made the whole march as if on a promenade, showing off their cleanness and discipline. The stages were short, their packs were transported in wagons. The Austrian authorities prepared excellent dinners for the officers all along the way. The regiments entered and left town to music for the whole march, something the guards took pride in. On the order of the Grand Duke, the men had walked in step, the officers on foot at their posts. All during the march, Boris had walked and quartered with Berg, who was now already a company commander. Berg, who had attained the company during the march, had managed by his efficiency and neatness to earn the confidence of his superiors and had arranged his financial affairs rather profitably. Boris had made many acquaintances during the march with people who could be useful to him. And through a letter of recommendation brought to him from Pierre, had become acquainted with Prince Andrei Bolkonsky, through whom he hoped to get a post on the commander-in-chief's staff. Berg and Boris, cleanly and neatly dressed, having rested after the day's march, were sitting at the round table in the clean apartment assigned to them and playing checkers. Berg was holding a smoking little pipe between his knees. Boris, with his particular neatness, has piled the pieces in a pyramid with his slender white hands, waiting for Berg's move and watching his partner's face, obviously thinking about the game, as he always thought only about what he was engaged in. "Well, how are you going to get out of it?" he said. "We'll try," replied Berg, touching a piece and taking his hand away again. Just then the door opened. "Ah, here he is at last," cried Rostov. "And Berg's here too. Ah, you petits enfants, allez coucher dormir," he cried, repeating the words of their nanny, at whom he and Boris used to laugh together. "Good heavens, how you've changed!" Boris rose to meet Rostov, but in rising did not forget to pick up the fallen chessmen and put them in place, and was about to embrace his friend, but Nikolai drew back from him. With that feeling peculiar to youth, which fears beaten paths and wants, not to imitate others, but to express its feelings in a new and personal way, only not in the often feigned way its elders do, Nikolai wanted to do something special on meeting his friend. He wanted somehow to pinch or push Boris, only not to kiss him as everyone does. Boris, on the contrary, calmly and amicably embraced Rostov and kissed him 3 times. They had not seen each other for nearly half a year, and at their age, when young men take their first steps on life's path, they both found enormous changes in each other, totally new reflections of the society in which they had taken their first steps in life. Both had changed greatly since their last meeting, and both wanted the sooner to show each other the changes that had taken place in them. "Ah, you cursed floor scrubbers, clean fresh as if from a promenade, not like us sinful army folk," Rostov said, with baritone sounds in his voice and an army manner that were new for Boris, pointing to his mud-splashed breeches. The German landlady stuck her head through the door, hearing Rostov's loud voice. "A pretty little thing, eh?" he said, winking. "Why are you shouting so? You'll frighten them," said Boris. "I wasn't expecting you today," he added. "I sent you a note just yesterday through an acquaintance. Kutuzov's adjunct, Bolkonsky. I didn't think he'd deliver it to you so soon." "Well, how are you? Already under fire?" asked Boris. Rostov, without answering, shook his soldier's cross of St. George that hung on the cords of his uniform and pointed to his arm in a sling, looked smiling at Berg. "As you see," he said. "Well, there! Yes, yes," said Boris, smiling. "And also, we had a nice march. You know, the Grand Duke constantly rode with our regiment, so we had all the conveniences and advantages. The receptions we had in Poland, the dinners, the balls, I can't tell you. And the Grand Duke was very gracious to all our officers. And the two friends began telling each other, the one about his hussars carousing and life at the front, and the other about the pleasures and advantages of serving under the command of highly placed persons, and so on. "Oh, you guards," said Rostov, "but listen, send for some wine." Boris winced. If you're sure you want it," he said, and going to his bed, he took a purse from under the clean pillows and ordered wine brought. "Yes, I have to get you your money and letter," he added. Rostov took the letter and, throwing the money on the sofa, leaned both elbows on the table and began to read. He read a few lines and glanced angrily at Berg. Having met his eyes, Rostov covered his face with the letter. "They sent you a decent sum of money, though," said Berg, looking at the heavy purse pressed down on the sofa. "And we just get by on our pay. Count, I'll tell you about myself. The thing is this, Berg, my dear," said Rostov. "If you received a letter from home and met one of your people whom you'd like to question about everything, and I happened to be there, I'd leave at once, so as not to interfere with you. Listen, please go away, somewhere, anywhere. Go to the devil," he cried, and taking him by the shoulder at once, and looking amiably into his face, obviously tried to soften the rudeness of his words, he added, "You know, don't be angry, my dear kind fellow. I'm speaking from the heart, as to our old acquaintance." "Oh, for pity's sake, Count, I understand very well," said Berg, getting up and speaking to himself in a guttural voice. "Go across to the landlord's. They invited you," added Boris. Berg put on the cleanest of frock coats, with not a speck or spot on it, fluffed up his whiskers in front of the mirror, and as Alexander Pavlovitch wrote them, and answered, and assuring himself from Rostov's glance that his frock coat had been noticed, left the room with a pleasant smile. "Ah, what a beast I am, though," said Rostov, reading the letter. "What's wrong?" "Ah, what a swine I am, though, that I didn't write even once and frighten them so. Ah, what a swine I am," he repeated, suddenly blushing. "So send Gavrilo for the wine. Let's have a drink," he said. Among the letters from his family there was also a letter of recommendation to Prince Bagration, which the old countess had obtained through acquaintances, on the advice of Anna Mikhailovna, and sent on to her son, asking him to take it to its destination and make use of it. "What stupidity, as if I need it," said Rostov, throwing the letter under the table. "Why did you throw it on the floor?" asked Boris. "It's some sort of letter of recommendation. What the devil is a letter to me?" "How do you mean, what the devil is a letter?" said Boris, picking it up and reading the address. "You need this letter very much." "I don't need anything. I won't go and be somebody's adjutant." "Why not?" asked Boris. "It's a lackey's job." "You're still the same dreamer, I see," said Boris, shaking his head. "And you're still the same diplomat." "Well, but that's not the point." "Well, how are you?" asked Boris. "As you see, so far everything's fine, but I confess my wish, and it's a great one, is to be an adjutant and not stay at the front." "Why?" "Because once you've set out on a career in military service, you should try to do all you can to make it a brilliant career." "Ah, so that's it," said Rostov, evidently thinking about something else. He looked intently and questioningly into his friend's eyes, evidently searching in vain for the answer to some question. Old Gavrilo brought the wine. "Shouldn't we send for Alphonse Karlik now?" asked Boris. "He'll drink with you. I can't." Send for him, send for him. Well, and what's this German like?" Rostov asked with a scornful smile. "He's a very good, honest, and agreeable man," said Boris. Rostov once again looked intently into Boris's eyes and sighed. Berg returned, and over a bottle of wine the conversation of these three officers became animated. The two guardsmen told Rostov about their march, about how they were honored in Russia, Poland, and abroad. They told about the words and deeds of their commander, the great Duke, anecdotes about his kindness and hot temper. Berg, as usual, kept silent about things that did not concern him personally, but on the occasion of anecdotes about the Grand Duke's hot temper, he told with delight how, in Galicia, he had managed to talk with the Grand Duke when he was making the rounds of the regiments, and waxed wroth at the incorrectness of a maneuver. With a pleasant smile on his face, he told how the Grand Duke, in great wrath, had ridden up to him and shouted, "Aronti!" Aronti was His Highness's favorite word when he was wrathful, and summoned the regimental commander. "Would you believe it, Count? I wasn't afraid at all, because I knew I was right. You know, Count, I can say, without boasting, that I know the regimental orders by heart, and I know the regulations like the Our Father in Heaven. That's why there's no negligence in my company, Count. So my conscience was at ease. I presented myself. Berg stood up and impersonated how he had presented himself with his hand to his visor. Indeed, it would be hard to impersonate any greater deference and self-satisfaction. He roasted me, as they say, roasted, roasted me not to the quick, but to death, as they say, Arunti and devils and to Siberia, Berg said, smiling shrewdly. I know I'm right, so I say nothing. Isn't that the way, Count? Are you mute or what? He shouts. I still say nothing. And what do you think, Count? The next day there was nothing in the orders. That's what it means not to get flustered. There you are, Count, said Berg, lighting his pipe and letting out little smoke rings. Yes, very nice, said Rostov, smiling. But Boris, noticing that Rostov was preparing to make fun of Berg, artfully diverted the conversation. He asked Rostov to tell them how and where he had received his wound. This pleased Rostov, and he began to tell the story, growing more and more animated as it went on. He told them about his Schongraben action in just the way that those who take part in battles usually tell about him. That is, in the way that they would like it to have been, the way they have heard others tell it, the way it would have been told more beautifully, but not at all the way it had been. Rostov was a truthful young man. Not for anything would he have deliberately told an untruth. He began telling the story with the intention of telling it exactly as it had been, but imperceptibly, involuntarily, and inevitably for himself, he went over into untruth. If he had told the truth to these listeners, who like himself had already heard accounts of attacks numerous times and had formed for themselves a definite notion of what an attack was and were expecting exactly that same sort of account, they would not have believed him, or, still worse, would have thought it was Rostov's own fault that what usually happens in stories of cavalry attacks had not happened with him. He could not simply tell them that they had all set out at a trot. He fell off his horse, dislocated his arm, and ran to the woods as fast as he could to escape a Frenchman. Besides, in order to tell everything as it had been, one would have to make an effort with oneself so as to tell only what had been. To tell the truth is very difficult, and young men are rarely capable of it. They were expecting an account of how he got all fired up, forgetting himself, how he flew like a storm at the square, how he cut his way in, hacking right and left with his saber, and how his saber tasted flesh, how he fell exhausted, and so on. And he told them all that. In the middle of the story, just as he was saying, "You can't imagine what a strange feeling of fury one experiences during an attack," Prince Andrei Bolkonsky, whom Boris was expecting, came in. Prince Andrei, who liked to patronize young men, who was very flattered to be turned to for a favor, and was well disposed towards Boris, who had managed to please him the day before, wished to fulfill the young man's wish. Sent by Kutuzov with papers for the Grand Duke, he stopped to see the young man, hoping to find him alone. Coming into the room and seeing a front-line hussar telling about his military adventures, the sort of people Prince Andrei could not stand, he smiled affectionately to Boris, winced, narrowed his eyes at Rostov, and bowing slightly, sat down wearily and lazily on the sofa. He was not pleased to have landed among bad company. Rostov blushed, understanding that, but it was all the same to him. The man was an outsider, but glancing at Boris, he saw that he, too, was ashamed of the front-line hussar. In spite of Prince Andrei's unpleasant, mocking tone, in spite of the general disdain which Rostov, from his new fighting army point of view, had for all of these staff adjutants, to whom the newcomer obviously belonged, Rostov felt embarrassed, turned red, and fell silent. Boris asked what was the news at the staff, and what, without being indiscreet, was rumored about our dispositions. They'll probably advance, Bolkonsky replied, clearly not wishing to say more in front of strangers. Berg used the opportunity to ask with particular courtesy whether, as a rumor had it, company commanders were now to draw a double allotment for forage, to which Prince Andrei replied with a smile that he was unable to opine about such important government instructions, and Berg laughed joyfully. About your affair, Prince Andrei turned to Boris again. We'll speak later. And he glanced at Rostov. Come to me after the review. We'll do all that's possible. In glancing around the room, he turned to Rostov, whose state of uncontrollable childish embarrassment, turning into spite, he did not deign to notice, and said, "It seems like you were telling about Schöngraben action. Were you there?" "I was there," Rostov said spitefully, as if wishing to insult the adjutant by it. Bolkonsky noticed the hussar's state and found it amusing. He gave a slightly contemptuous smile. "Yes, many stories are told now about that action." "Yes, stories," Rostov began speaking loudly, glancing now at Boris, now at Volkhonsky, with eyes suddenly grown furious. Yes, many of these stories are told, but our stories, the stories of those who were there, right under enemy fire, our stories have weight, not the stories of those fellows on the staff who get rewards for doing nothing. To whom you suppose that I belong? Prince Andrei said calmly, and with an especially pleasant smile. A strange feeling of spite, and along with that, of respect for the calmness of this figure came together at that moment in Rostov's soul. I'm not talking about you, he said. I don't know you, and I confess I don't wish to. I'm talking about the staff in general. And I will tell you this, Prince Andrei interrupted him with calm power in his voice. You want to insult me, and I'm ready to agree with you that it is very easy to do so, if you lack sufficient respect for yourself. But you must agree that the time and place have been rather poorly chosen for that. One of these days we'll all take part in a big, more serious duel. And besides that, And besides that, Drubetskoy, just please break a Russian name up into the middle of 2 pages. That's helpful. And so, besides that, Drubetskoy, who says he's your old friend, is not at all to blame for the fact that my physiognomy has the misfortune not to please you. However, he said, getting up, you know my name and where to find me, but don't forget, he added, that I consider myself nor you insulted in the least, and my advice, as an older man, is to let this matter go without consequence. So I'll be writing for you on Friday after the review, Drubetskoy. Goodbye, Prince Andrei concluded and left, after bowing to them both. Rostov remembered what reply he should have given only when the man had already gone, and he was the more angry because he had forgotten to say it. Rostov ordered his horse brought at once, and having dryly taken leave of Boris, rode home. Should he go to headquarters tomorrow and challenge this mincing adjutant, or indeed let the affair go at that? This was the question that tormented him all the way. Now he thought spitefully of what a pleasure it would be to see this small, weak, and proud man's fear in the face of his pistol. Then he was surprised to feel that, of all the people he knew, there was no one he so wished to have for a friend as this hateful little adjutant. And we'll stop there for today. The foolishness of youth. That's going to be my only commentary on that. Or maybe I should poison their egos. He's young. That Nikolai Rostov. I find it very pleasing how Tolstoy has woven together so many of the different characters whose lives are very interconnected or seem to like brush by each other. Like I have to remind myself that, that Nikolai Rostov doesn't know who Andrei Bolkonsky is. I'm like, but didn't they go to a party or something? No, they didn't. It's just that they both know Pierre and, or they both know Prince Vasily, and it's interesting. Yeah, it's kind of funny how he puffs himself up, but he's like, 19, 20-year-old young man whose first real action and real place in the world is this, being out on the front, and he hurts himself. And it seems the tradition of these military men is to tell these grand stories about the battle where it's like, really, your horse got shot and you fell off, you twisted your arm, then you had to run away so you didn't get shot. Because your whole company got itself into a horrible mess because your leader and the leader of the neighboring company were having a pissing match between themselves and weren't paying attention to the fact that they were being surrounded. But that's just colorful commentary on what is an already interesting story. But he was a coward. Was he a coward? Was Nikolai Rostov a coward, though? I don't know. I didn't read it as him being cowardly. I kind of just read it as him being young, inexperienced, and put in a really, really bad situation. And it's, I liked how Tolstoy wrote it. If you read back to the battle scene, he kind of wrote it with this sense of confusion, which I always felt was an extension of the confusion that the military men, particularly this young man, felt. These wealthy people don't understand. Well, I mean, most people don't understand battle until you're actually in it. And, you know, even now, like movies and Hollywood and the news make it sound maybe more glamorous or more exciting or more noble, but it's like someone told me who was a fighter once, who told me how street fights are never like what you see, you know? It's never like, oh yeah, and then he did this move, and then it's like people are pulling each other's hair. And in battle, it's, you know, yeah, like you're saying, the grittiness and hardness of war, it's gritty, and it's not pretty, it's not elegant, it's not this grand battle, it's hard, and it's really scary, and it's probably really, really disorienting. So yeah. Cowardly, maybe. Unprepared and naive, definitely. So, but anyways, I hope he becomes friends with Volokhonsky, because while Volokhonsky can be a bit of a snob about things, I think he's one of the few sensible characters. So that is all for today, my friends. We will continue tomorrow at 3 to pick up again. And that puts us 2/10 of the way, or 1/5 of the way through the book. So it'll take a little bit to get through, but we're making headway. So thank you all very much, and I'll see you tomorrow. And like I said, if you missed anything, check out the War and Peace playlist on my channel that has all the readings. We didn't read on Monday because I was unable to be here at 3 to read. I had errands and stuff. So other than that, everything is Monday through Friday at 3 p.m. So thank you all very much, and see you tomorrow. Have a great Wednesday. Do something fun.